Thank you all very much. We hope in the course of the next half hour or so that we'll be able to not just enlighten you about the needs of our society in terms of how we deal with our veterans, but motivate you to get involved as well. Stan and General Powell and I have talked about this issue before, so we have some familiarity with how we all think about it, and we're eager to share that with you today. What Stan can do better than almost anyone I know is describe for you the kind of young man or woman who is now enlisting in the armed forces and how their lives are shaped by that experience. I do think it would be helpful, Stan, for people to have a clearer portrait of what happens to an 18 or 19-year-old man or woman going into any of the branches of the service and how it affects their early life and how it forms them, if you will.
Thanks, Tom, and I appreciate the chance to be here today and for everyone's interest. If we start at sort of the inflection point, there's an explosion, or there's a burst of machine gun fire, or there's a single rifle shot, and an American is wounded. And that's happened for 200 years of our history, but it's an inflection point in that typically young person's life. And things start to change. Immediately they provide aid to themselves, and buddies come to provide aid, and then medics come. And typically, very quickly, within an hour, so that we can get them to a hospital, a helicopter comes, picks that individual up, and flies them off. And the individual is being treated while they're on the helicopter, and their buddies stay on the ground in the fight. And the fight often continues, and they watch the helicopter, and they get further from their buddies. But it didn't start there. It started in a small town or in a city or in a neighborhood like you know, and it started when a young person got the feeling that they ought to enter the service. And sometimes it was because their father or grandfather or uncle or brother served. Sometimes they lost a loved one. Sometimes it was just an idea that they got. Sometimes they get the complete support of their community and people make a big deal about them leaving, and sometimes they actually do it over some of the protests and concerns of friends or family. Sometimes they've tried college or work and it didn't work out for them, and they've decided that they just feel like they need to serve, and they do that. Once they join the military, it's a completely different life from anything you've done, and no matter what the recruiter tells you, it's never like that. And so you get there, and immediately the service wants to make you a service member, a soldier, sailor, airman, or Marine, and they dress you differently, they have you learn different language. But really what they're trying to do is make you part of a team. It's no longer part of an individual. It's all being part of a team, and the team's more important than the individual. So from the very beginning of basic training and then advanced training, and then when they are sent to their first unit, they're always in groups. They're always in teams or squads or squadrons or flights, whatever the different services call them. And they're part of that, and then they're assigned to a permanent force. And they might be in a squad, they might be in a platoon or battery. And what we stress is cohesion, being part of that. Do your part. Do your share of the effort that everyone has to do, so that your buddies can rely on you. And then the word comes that they're going to deploy to combat, and that is even reinforced more because everything about combat is about team. And the saying is, I'll never leave a fallen comrade to fall into the hands of the enemy, is a responsibility on every soldier for every comrade, and it's all about devoting yourself to the team. And so as they come, they have done something that we as Americans ask them to do. We ask them to believe. We ask them to believe in themselves, we ask them to believe in each other, their comrades, and we ask them to believe in the nation. So as they go forward, they are now part of a team, and we've asked them, and they have accepted the responsibility that comes with believing. And so if you think from that moment, this team that has become family, suddenly as the helicopter flies away, the team becomes further and further. And as they fly away from that team, although they still have deep feelings, physically it gets further, emotionally it gets further, at a very difficult time in their lives. And that's why it's so important that we, as the rest of America, be ready to be the team that they come back to.
General Powell, it is at least on the table in this country at the moment about what we do with returning veterans. We've got the Wounded Warrior Project. J.P. Morgan Chase has gotten deeply involved. I've written about it and talked about it. You've talked about it. It was a lot different when you came home from Vietnam. And then in the ensuing years, for all that the military did about reinventing itself, which it really did, it didn't pay a lot of attention to the idea of how we make the transition from a military life to a civilian life.
No, that's quite true. First of all, let me say how pleased I am to be here with my old friend Tom and with General McChrystal. I didn't work with General McChrystal, but I worked for his father 40 years ago, General Herb McChrystal. I was just counting the years the other night, Stan. It's scary. But that's quite true. We came home from Vietnam, and the country did not welcome us as they have welcomed subsequent generations, especially the current generation. And the most difficult part of that was the country also said, we are not going to have conscription anymore. You, career officers, you change this army so that it becomes a volunteer army. Go and find your soldiers in the labor market. Go find them in the villages and towns of America. And we did that. And over a period of about 5 or 6 years, we created an absolutely splendid force of young men and women who are willing to serve their country as volunteers. And they had the same tradition, the same culture, the same loyalty and dedication as any other generation of Americans that have ever gone before. And they proved themselves in the Gulf War and the Panama invasion, and they have proved themselves in the last 10 years in Iraq and in Afghanistan. But the theme we have to keep in mind is something that President Lincoln said in his second inaugural address: to care for those who have borne the battle, widow and children. To care. That means that never forget that they are carrying the American spirit. They are carrying the American traditions with them. And when they get injured, when they get hurt, or when they just come back to be reintegrated into society, we have to be waiting to care for them. It's not just the federal government, it's not just the Veterans Administration, it's their fellow citizens who have to care for them. Many of our soldiers, in fact, most of our soldiers, come back from Iraq and Afghanistan, and if they leave the service, all they want to do is to integrate back into society. So they want jobs, they want homes, they want to rebuild their family relationships or create a new family. Government can help, but it's really up to us. The government can always do more. We can always increase the GI Bill sort of benefits. We can always do more with respect to Veterans Administration, but nothing is as important as companies like JP Morgan and Chase or Next Door Neighbor reaching out to help a young GI, as I still call them, as they reintegrate into their community. We owe that to them. It is our obligation because they have discharged their obligation to us. And so a lot has changed, and what makes this period so much different than either Vietnam or even World War II is that these youngsters have been going back and forth, especially the non-commissioned officers have been going back and forth for almost 10 or 12 years, depending. And they come home for 6 months and they're gone again. I've known soldiers, and I'm sure Stan has similar examples, who have been on multiple tours, 5, 6 tours. And Stan can attest to that himself. And we ask so much of them. And unlike some other conflicts that we have had in the past where there are moments of terrible danger and then there are quiet periods, in Iraq and Afghanistan, there's no such thing. Every morning you could get blown apart by an IED. And so the tension that they were under, the pressure that these young people were under, was perhaps as great as any generation of warriors that America has ever put in the field. And we have seen them come back with post-traumatic stress problems. We have seen them come back with traumatic brain injury. Stan and I both know, we both have been to hospitals in Walter Reed. We know how to save them. We know how to protect the torso, but we can't quite protect the head of the limbs. And the blast effects of the IEDs are blowing off limbs. I was at Walter Reed just about a month ago and came to a crosswalk as I was driving onto the base, and a mother was pushing her son across the street in a wheelchair, missing 2 legs. I went to the next intersection, another crosswalk, and a wife was pushing her husband across the street, missing 2 legs. And in the course of my time at Walter Reed, and Stan does it all around the country as well, you see these terrible injuries, and the brain injuries especially. TBI is so much worse because you can get a prosthetic limb, but to recover from some of the more serious traumatic brain injuries may never happen. We celebrated one such young soldier at the Memorial Day concert 2 or 3 years ago, and I felt so badly because his mother and his sister were now faced with that problem of caring for this young man for the rest of their lives and the rest of his life. And so we owe so much to these men and women who have served us. Most of them are coming back. As was pointed out in the introductory remarks, they're going to make a contribution to their companies, to their communities, to wherever they go. And they're going to be great, just like previous generations of soldiers. But we also have a generation coming back that's going to need our help. And so don't wait for a Chase or a JP Morgan. Look around your own community. Look in the community next to yours where you might find some of these young veterans. If they need a house, can you chip in to help create a handicap facility for a home so they can get in and out? If you see somebody who's having some trouble in their life that you have come across, can you reach out and say, hey, how you doing? Come on over for dinner. Very often a lot of these problems of stress disorder have to do with loneliness and not turning loose of the war that you were a part of. You can help with that. Don't shy away. Don't look the other way. Just don't greet them at an airport. We need you to greet them in their communities. We need you to reach out to them and their children and the spouses of these families because they did so much for us. We have that obligation to them.
Stan, you've been in the midst of this transition that a lot of them are making, and when they first began to come home, a lot of the private sector didn't quite know how to deal with it. And one of my very favorite stories was, I think he was a captain who came home, and the personnel officer said, I don't see any qualifications or experience here. And he said, I don't know, on a regular basis, about once every 2 weeks, I'd lead a squad into a village in Afghanistan, clean out the bad guys, meet with the village elders, rebuild the sanitation system, get them power, and build a medical clinic of some kind. I think it counts for something. Has the private sector begun to tune in to the capabilities that a lot of these young people have that may not fit their idea of a Harvard MBA?
I think slowly we have, and I think it's from both sides. I think one, military service members, most of whom never really had a civilian job. They may have had something before they entered. They've probably never done a resume, never done a job interview, not done some of the things that allow them to build up the experience and context that help other people. And then they come out a few years older from the experience, and as Tom outlined, what they put on paper, driving a tank, may not line up with a company that says, well, we don't have any tanks. What will we do with this guy? But it's a $3 million piece of equipment. It's got a 4-man crew. It's got to be maintained. It's got to be operated and all those things. So even at very junior levels, you have this extraordinary amount of responsibility. We're starting to see much better appreciation through some job fairs, through some of the transition programs, but there's a lot left to do. And particularly in a tough business environment where businesses are really trying to make sure that they get the right kinds of skills, there's pressure on human resource departments to get just the right fit. In reality, we can do more to mine the kinds of experiences that young people bring back. As General Powell mentioned, the vast majority come back not just well, they come back better. They have done things that have matured and seasoned them. And so I think we can do more on the paperwork and connection side to mine what's really an opportunity. It's not a burden for the nation to carry. It's a mine for us to pull this extraordinary resource out of.
And through the GI Bill, which has been renewed, thanks to Senator Webb and others who were veterans who have served, are they getting the kind of training that they need for the demands of the modern economy?
I think it's available. I think that we can do better with it. There are some facts like completion rates for GI Bill education are not as high as they ought to be. And I think that we can structure some of those programs a little bit better so that individuals who start school have the kind of support mechanisms to be able to finish either an associate's degree or a bachelor's degree if that's their goal. But we can do better at that. There are well-intentioned programs that aren't quite as efficient or effective to this point as I hope they'll be in the future.
You know, I know from two personal experiences, one at the Wharton School of Business and the one at the University of Iowa. The University of Iowa offers in-state tuition to returning veterans. And I said to the president, what's the impact on the campus? She said, beyond my ability to describe it. We've got 200 of them. They've lifted the entire campus. Now, as someone who went through the University of Iowa, I could have used that kind of mentoring and leadership at one point. We don't have to go through that again, General Powell. We've talked about that. But I think that that's a value added, if you will, when these young men and women come back and enter an academic or a training program of some kind.
I couldn't agree more. At my alma mater, the City College of New York, we have a specific program in the Powell Center that I'm happy to have named after me there. And we take in GIs, returning GIs, and we have mentoring programs for them. We have programs that get them up to speed if they have some weakness in their earlier academic career that needs correction. And we have money that is used to supplement not only their academic costs, but the cost of living. So we think every university, and I think more and more universities are doing that. It's especially important now because the economy is still in a weak state, slowly improving, but still weak, and this affects our veterans. The other thing is that unlike after World War II or after Korea or even Vietnam, you can come back and find a job that does not require the highest skill. Or if in World War II you worked in a car factory before the war, when the war is over and they started making cars again, you could just go right back in. But increasingly, our society is becoming more complex, our economy is becoming more complex. You need a higher level of skill, especially with respect to the information revolution. You know, I used to be a shade tree mechanic. I love taking carburetors apart. People don't know what a carburetor is these days. And so you have to be skilled to handle that kind of machine. And increasingly, those are the jobs that are going to be available for American youngsters, not stitching two pieces of cloth together.
Are we able, Stan, better able to match up the requirements, military and civilian life? As an example, as I think you know, if you're a military licensed truck driver, operate a big 8x8 truck of some kind, that license does not transfer to the civilian side of things.
No, it doesn't. And that is just one of the examples of places where an individual will have very relevant experience that ought to relate into certification or licensing or approval to be able to operate in a field. Maybe there should be a little bit of tweaking for that state or locality's requirements, but we don't do that very well right now. And so as a consequence, many of the skills that service members come out with aren't leveraged like they could and should be. And there are an awful lot of high-tech information technology skills.
The government has really latched onto this in recent months. And what they have done is gotten all of the government departments involved. What are the certification requirements to be a nurse or a truck driver or something like this? And what can we do to take a returning veteran into a system where you get the additional skill or certification requirements met so that you can get the certificate for that particular job? So I think the government's finally mobilizing itself to do that.
And what we need to make everyone aware of course, is when you think about returning veterans, you may think of the classic warrior who has been spending the last 9 months on patrol in a Kevlar vest and a helmet and a set of goggles. You have nurse practitioners, you have people who repair things, I've been on the USS Stennis down in the bowels, and these 18-year-old kids were keeping the electronic system of that entire nuclear aircraft carrier going. And it seems to me that they are extraordinarily ahead of their age group or their cohort when they come back.
Absolutely. The thing that the military probably does better than anything else it does is train people. It's an education factory, and it starts people, it gives them a wide variety of skills, and the ability to produce that and then to have them matriculate up to fairly experienced levels is built into the system, and it's something that can be tapped into by American industry and by American business.
There's something there are a lot of groups around the country. Wounded Warrior Project, something in St. Louis done by a remarkable young man who was a former Navy SEAL called The Mission Continues. And he works a lot with gravely wounded veterans. And we can't forget them as well. And they can bring something to the workplace or to community service, which we ought not to forget about, Colin. I mean, there's a young man who's a member of the Minnesota State Senate, lost both legs. He said, I was a knucklehead before I lost both legs. In a way, it made me a better person. He went into the Minnesota State Senate. He became the conscience of that Senate in so many ways. We can't overlook that piece of it as well.
Yeah. I was at a dinner a couple of years ago, and some wounded warriors were invited to the dinner, and I sat next to this sergeant who had lost 3 limbs, 2 legs and 1 arm. And he was there with his lovely young wife, and he was about 27 years old. And we talked for a little bit, made small talk, and then finally got to, well, tell me what happened and what are you going to do now? And he told me what happened. And then he said, you know, I was contacted by a real estate company in San Francisco, the other side of the country. And they knew about my situation. And they said, if you come out here as a trainee, we will teach you the real estate business. And we know how to teach real estate business, and then we will have a job for you. And he says, so we're moving to California, and I can't wait to get started. And I subsequently learned that he's been very successful. What he said to me right after that almost brought me to tears. He said, you know, General, this is probably the worst thing that's ever happened to me, but it might be the best thing that's ever happened to me. That spirit, that willingness to look ahead. This is the situation I am now. I'm not going to let it get me down. Give me my prosthetic limbs, give me my prosthetic arms, and turn me loose. And I will show you what I can still do. As Stan has pointed out, these kids not only have particular technical skills, they've been trained to say, yes, sir. They show up on time. They are disciplined. They have been trained to get the job done. And as Stan also pointed out, it all starts at the very beginning when we take them into basic training. We put them in a group of human beings. We teach them right face, left face. If one guy goes right when he's supposed to go left, everybody suffers, and you learn the importance of teamwork. And it's also an efficient way to move a group of human beings around by marching them. They're introduced to a drill sergeant, and the drill sergeant is the worst thing they could have ever imagined. And he just, I am now your mother and your daddy. And so forget everything you learned at home, you're going to now learn it from me. And they hate him immediately. But after about 8 weeks or so, they don't hate him any longer. The overwhelming emotion at that point is to please him. This guy has shared all the dangers with us. He has taught us. He has trained us. My gosh, look at what we're at now. We're going to be the honor platoon at graduation. And their only emotion is to please that drill sergeant, and they will never forget his name for the rest of their lives. That kind of bonding takes place. And the other thing I'm sure Stan will reinforce, when you talk to the kids in the hospital, if they have any chance of recuperating and going back, they want to go back. First thing they'll say to you is, I want to get back with my team. I want to get back with my buddies. They fight for the country, they fight for a cause, but above all, they fight for each other because they're a team, as Stan pointed out.
And even if they can't get back to their military unit and know that, they say they'll look you in the eye and to a man and woman say, I want to continue to serve in some fashion. And that's a value added that companies can't really build into a job description, Stan.
In 2005, I had a non-commissioned officer wounded in action in Iraq, and he lost a leg just about right above the knee. And I was still in the fight, and Annie went to visit him, and she went in, and he said, tell the boss I'm coming back. And she thought, well, that's great, but that's not realistic. And then he knew I liked Monty Python a lot, so he said, tell the boss it's only a flesh wound. About a year later, this is a commando, about a year later, I went on a raid in Baghdad with a squadron, and he was back on a prosthetic doing an operation in Baghdad, and he's still on active duty to this day. He's that kind of guy, and there are lots of those kinds of men and women. But listen, this is a test. When someone is wounded, it tests them. It tests inside. It tests their family. It tests their young spouse. It tests their parents. It tests their children. It tests everybody. But it tests us even more. We were talking before this, and I did some numbers research, and during the Civil War, there were about 500,000 Americans wounded. Not killed, but wounded. And with a 34 million person population, that was about 1 for every 68 Americans. So there was a wounded person in your town or village, probably in your family. And so you were comfortable. You saw people who had been wounded in war. That was familiar to you. There have been 46,000 Americans wounded in Iraq and Afghanistan. But with our current population, that's about 1 wounded for every 7,392 Americans. So most of us don't see a wounded service member very often, certainly not in your town, not in your coffee shop, not in your school. But it's a test of us as a group of people. What are we going to do about it? Are we a family? As General Powell said, do we catch those who we are responsible for, who served for us at our bidding? And I think that's the measure of society.
Let me underscore one point. We're talking about veterans. The spouses who stay at home are also veterans. The children who are at home wondering about daddy or mommy, they're also veterans. they are going through their own transition. They are suffering in ways that are not immediately visible to us. The Veterans Administration is not watching this. But I can tell you, they have served and suffered just as much, if not exposed to the kind of danger as their loved one overseas. And so as you run into these folks, and I hope it's not a matter of running, but as you seek them out and see what you can do, what each and every one of us can do, remember that it is the whole family that has to be taken care of and not just the veteran.
Because we're going to reserve the last 10 minutes for try to get at some solutions here. I think it's terribly important we have the kind of exposition that we've just had, but we also ought to think as a society about what do we do next as we leave here. Let me just give you two small examples. One is that I've been following a young man from the 3rd ID, who was a mortar squad sergeant at the beginning of the war. And I kept track of him during the war, and he came home and he's having a hard time finding a job. He moved to northern Wisconsin, where his wife became a special ed teacher, but he couldn't find work because he was in the middle of this recession. We put a profile of him on the air, as we have periodically. Northwest of Chicago, a man by the name of Mike Costigan, who's an internet marketer, saw the profile, realized he'd been sitting at home making a lot of money while they'd been fighting the war, looked him up, found his address, drove to Wisconsin, knocked on his door, took him to lunch, and said, "Young man, I think I've got work for you." And Charles said to him, "How much is it going to cost me?" And Mike said, "You paid enough." He's now his number one provider, salesman on the internet of used cars. There's a whole business in America, we were talking about it earlier, that I didn't realize existed. You want to sell your 1996 Camaro for $500, you go online and somebody buys it, and then what happens is Charles does the deal. He's now hired 3 other veterans to go to work in his marketing company. That's one perfect small example for small businesses to get proactive and go out there and look for them. The other one is I have 2 dear friends who both Vietnam veterans. She was a nurse at Walter Reed. He lost a leg. He was a great hockey star at Brown. They're at St. Lawrence University now in northern New York. He's been successful in business, and that's his hometown. They moved back. She goes to Fort Drum and works with the returning veterans and finds housing for them in St. Lawrence. And then she goes up and down the neighborhood and says to the neighbors, if he starts his motorcycle at midnight, don't say anything. There may be a little more beer drinking going on in our neighborhood, but go by and say hello and find a way to connect to him in some fashion. So the fact of the matter is that wars downrange are won from the ground up, and when they come home, we heal their wounds from the ground up as well, Stan.
Exactly.
The question is, for someone who's out here who has a small business, where can they go to find out what's going on? The best way to do it is to go online and just type in veterans who need work, and you'll find sites that will do that. We had something called Robin Hood in New York, which we had a big summit meeting all day long, in which people who were employers, and Mike Mullen, who is the former chairman of the Joint Chief, came, and we put online the skill set of a lot of these veterans and tried to raise the consciousness of what is going on. So when businesses talk to you as you interface with them, what is it they ask you most of all about what they need to know?
It is typically that question, how do we connect with veterans so that if we have a series of jobs that require certain backgrounds, how we can identify that and get to the population of people who might be interested geographically and skill-wise or into training programs that would do that. We are doing better at that. The internet offers extraordinary opportunities to do that. There are elements that help connect resumes, help military service members write their resume in a way that connects with human resources. Many of those are now done digitally, and so if you don't have the right keywords, they don't automatically connect. So some of that is being done. It's still not perfect, to be honest. It's still harder to find the body of available veterans than we would like it to be. And so I think that's one of the areas we can look. It's also very good for companies to track how many veterans you have. In many cases, you don't know, and I'm not talking about quotas, but I'm talking having a sense of how many veterans you have and using existing veterans to help you network to other veterans. You'd be surprised how talent can find talent in many cases. And an organization that is very veteran-friendly and interested will find talent comes this way because word of mouth will come very, very rapidly.
Just to underscore that, I've worked with a lot of companies in the course of my travels around the United States, and the ones that are doing the best job of this have made it part of their culture, part of their business plan. It just doesn't happen serendipitously, or a veteran walks in or somebody hears about a veteran. They task their managers and their subordinate leaders to go find veterans and measure them against a particular standard of how many veterans they expect to see in the organization. You got to go out and search for them. You got to go look for them. You got to help them. They're not just going to walk in the door. And I think if you just went online and threw in any search keywords or phrases you'd like to, helping veterans, go to the Veterans Administration, go to the Department of Defense, and you will find dozens and dozens of sites that can tell you how to get in touch with veterans, how to run a job fair, or how to look for a particular skill set in an individual that you need for your organization. Stan touched on this earlier. Sometimes you are going to have to do more than just check a skill set out and then hire somebody. A lot of these youngsters went in when they were 17, 18, 19 years old, just out of high school. They may pick up a lot of things in the Army, but they didn't come in with a particular skill. You may have to have a program that builds on that early education and gives them the training they need for the jobs that you have for them, and not just expect them to walk through the door. Expect for them to walk through the door with everything that you need. You may have to provide training, mentoring, and other kinds of support group activities for these young people.
Colin, how do we use this experience that we are all now much more aware of to establish a template? Because we're going to go to war again at some point. We hope not in our lifetime, but it will happen again. And this kind of issue will be probably even more critical at that time, given the changing nature of the economy and the global economy. Do we require more legislation? Should it come from the private sector? Should it be a combination of the two? How do we deal with this downstream?
It has to be a public-private partnership. Government can't do it all. And the government's most important role was to make sure that we have GI Bill activities and we have funded all of our programs. But then the government has to reach out and help communities set up systems that will help these veterans. States should get involved, and states are involved. Cities should be involved. And so I think it's a public-private partnership. Let's hope we don't get in another conflict that lasts 10 years.
Stan, you've been teaching at Yale. Yeah. You've been teaching leadership at Yale. It's very popular, as I know. There was a time when no returning military officer could have gone onto an Ivy League campus and taught a course in leadership. Moreover, in the Ivy League schools, they're now returning ROTC to the campus. Do you think that we're finally healing the wounds of Vietnam and that time and closing the gap between those who served and those who did not by having these kinds of discussions?
I think we are. I was coming out of the gym a couple weeks ago up at Yale early morning, and I walked across the green, and there was this line about 300 yards in front of me of white, and it was the 9 Naval ROTC students now. That is the start. And after 40 years of not having any kind of ROTC, it's a great start. I think we are making progress. I think it's going to take a lot of work, though, because if the military and civilian parts of society aren't forcing themselves together, you build up fear, you build up mistrust because you just don't know. One of the things that General Powell talked about, you have to find veterans. It's very frightening for a veteran to go to a university or to go into business. This is a veteran who may have walked into incredible danger in Iraq or Afghanistan, but it's frightening to walk into a company and try to get a job because you've never been there. It's a different culture. Same with going to a big university. So I think the organizations, the institutions have got to open their arms, and then there are going to have to be an awful lot of veterans, and then some who've already led the way help lead those behind us saying, it's okay, you're going to do fine. It is different than after World War II because it's a smaller population, which actually makes it harder because they're more of a minority. And so it's important we do all these things to reassure them and the organizations.
I need a point of order.
You can go on this time because I don't want to go through that again.
It's not just Ivy League schools. I'm proud to say that my college, the City College of New York, a public institution that serves the inner city section of New York, they did away with ROTC about 15 years after I graduated because of the Vietnam War, they have just decided to bring ROTC back this year.
I want to just leave you with one story and one thought, if I can. And the story is this. I was in Minnesota a couple of years ago. They've got something called the typical Minnesota Nights. They got the Minnesota Military Appreciation Fund. It's a big fund that they collect money for rehab and for college and for a lot of other things. And everybody shows up. It's a big idea that unifies the entire state. And the speaker was a mother of a National Guardsman who had gone back 3 times to Iraq. She's a very big executive at the Target Corporation. She really didn't want to be involved with her son's activities. She went off to see him off, and then the colonel turned and said, "Your son has named you the chair of the parents who are left behind." So she took on the responsibility, thinking, "I'm really busy. I don't know whether I have time for this." And then she looked around at all these young mothers with their children who were crying because their daddy had gotten on the airplane. And she thought, well, I owe it not just to my son, but I owe it to my country and to these young people. And then she gave me the most haunting line I've ever heard. She said, "I quickly learned when you're a military mother, you go home and draw the blinds on the window that looks out across the driveway because you can't bear the idea that a military vehicle will arrive and a chaplain will get out." I always thought that was a template for what military families go through. The rest of us don't have that kind of fear. What we do have is not just the opportunity, but the obligation to reach out to those families and these returning veterans. And we couldn't have had 2 better representatives of the military services in our nation's history than General McChrystal and General Powell to take us through what our common obligation is. Thank you all very much.